Good morning. Okay, so today I'm going to start the section of the course on security and conflict issues, and I want to start that with, in some sense, what's the fundamental question about conflict, which is why it occurs. Why do, in some situations, state actors choose to use violence in world politics? Okay, so up here we have the three different learning objectives for today's class, the three things you should check and see if you're able to do after the end of class. And so where I want to start with is sort of an example of a threat to use force that eventually ended up in actual warfare and fighting. And ask the question, why did the United States go to war with Afghanistan? Okay, so after the 9/11 attacks, at least in the United States as well as other parts of the world, suspicion was focused on the Al-Qaeda network, at that time led by Osama bin Laden, who was residing in Afghanistan, where there were substantial Al-Qaeda training camps. And 9 days after the attacks on September 20th, President Bush issued an ultimatum to the Taliban government of Afghanistan with the following set of demands. And there's 6 different points there. And I'm not going to sit here and read each of them off separately, but you can sort of scan through them and see the different things that the United States was demanding. On September 22nd, 2 days later, the Taliban, having considered this, refused to hand over bin Laden. Now, they didn't say anything about the other points here, but they just refused to. They said, he's our honored guest. We know he's a good Muslim. You haven't produced any evidence that shows he was responsible for this, so we don't just go around handing over people to you because you asked for them. And then about 2 weeks later, on October 7th, the U.S. military began to attack targets inside Afghanistan, at which point the long history of the U.S. involvement on the ground in Afghanistan begins. Now, the initial period of the war lasted only a few months, in which the U.S. presence was primarily CIA operatives and special forces who were basically carrying out the targeting part of the mission for the various U.S. Air Force and naval planes that were carrying out airstrikes in support of the rebels against the Taliban government. And over a period of about 3 months, they sweep the Taliban government out and install a new government in Kabul. Okay, and then of course after that, as we'll see later in the class, when we get to the class on civil wars, obviously the wars goes on past this period. But this is the interstate part of it, where 2 or more countries are fighting one another. Now, there obviously is going to be a civil war aspect to this too, but we'll talk about that later when I talk about civil war. Okay, so this is sort of a list of all the demands that the United States made. And where I want to start with first is with an activity here. And you can talk to your neighbor about it. It's going to be an open response. Why did the United States go to war with the Taliban? So you can talk to your neighbor about it and send in an answer if you'd like. It's a free response question. Okay, we got about 53 replies right now, so I'm going to go ahead and finish this up. Okay, got up to 63. Okay, so we have a variety of different answers here that people say. So there's, looks like show dominance is important, felt threatened, retaliation, protect global reputation, revenge. Okay, threat they pose to U.S. security. But if it was just a question of retaliation or revenge, why would you send an ultimatum? Because after all, the ultimatum presumably, that's a threat, because it's a threat to say if you don't do all the things we've asked, we're going to go to war with you. On the other hand, it also presumably has an unstated promise behind it, which is if you do all these things, we won't attack you. And then you wouldn't get the retaliation now, would you? Okay, so the retaliation story, while it has some elements of what might have motivated some of what the U.S. did, it can't explain why the parties ended up going to war. All right, now there's another set of answers here, which are things like the Taliban did not comply with the U.S.'s ultimatum. Taliban refused to hand over bin Laden. Okay, here, the Taliban would not hand over bin Laden for trial in the U.S. Okay, here part of the question is, well, why was that the case that the Taliban wouldn't do that? So one of the things I want to develop here is if I want to think about explaining that, I'm going to have to say something about what both sides do. That it's not just a matter of what the U.S. does there, it's also a matter of what the Taliban did, and to think through that. Okay, and so as a result, I can go through and talk about a variety of different things. So there's others here, like it says, because the U.S. government could not allow a terrorist group to attack its citizens without any actions taken against them. Well, there's a whole variety of actions that could be taken. So if you know, I suspect few of you know this history, but like, so for example, President Clinton used to carry out cruise missile strikes on Taliban camps or suspected, or not Taliban, Al-Qaeda camps or suspected Al-Qaeda facilities after the attacks on the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. So there are other ways to retaliate short of going to war. Okay, so what I want to develop today is a story that tries to explain why war happens and why it is parties, in some cases, will choose to use force to advance the positions they have in world politics, and try and elaborate that and extend that and think about that. Now, to think about that story, I've got to talk about something about what both sides do. Because one of the things that's really key here in this story is that war is a result of what both sides do. And in explaining war, you can't just say, well, one party wanted war. You've got to say something about why each party did what they did that then led to war. And that's the story I'm going to try and develop today. Okay, but where I want to start with first is if this is a story about the reason why countries use force or threaten to use force is they want to get their way on some issue that's important to them, I need to talk a little bit about what are the things that they fight over. So, and here the point is we know from the first principle that countries have conflicts of interest in some areas. Not in everything, but some. And so one thing that's true about world politics is that many different countries, they have conflicts of interest. They disagree about things. Now, the issues they could disagree over have a wide range of things. In some cases, they're territorial. So if you think about, like, for example, the contest over islands in the East China and the South China Sea, those are essentially territorial conflicts of interest. The parties disagree about who should possess those islands and the consequences that has for the territorial waters around them. In some cases, these issues are political. So the issues between the United States and the Taliban in 2001 are primarily political issues. One of my favorite lines from around that period was former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld saying, "The United States covets no one's land, especially not Afghanistan." That is, U.S. troops weren't there to make Afghanistan the 51st state, but the issues between them were political. And they centered around the fact that Al-Qaeda had a large substantial base and large number of camps in Afghanistan, and the United States, because after all, Osama bin Laden had declared war on the United States in 1997, saw him as a threat, and therefore wanted the Taliban to close down those camps and those other facilities because of the action. That's fundamentally a political argument, or a political conflict of interest. And understandably, the Taliban didn't want to do that. They can also be ideological. And so in some cases, for example, in the Cold War, the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union it covers a lot of dimensions, but one of those dimensions is ideological. That the United States and its allies argue for free polities and free economies, both inside countries and across countries. The Soviet Union argued for a communist system in which you'd have a single party that would dominate politics and that it would manage the economy. So believe in a centralized, planned economy. That's fundamentally an ideological dispute. Okay, now these conflicts of interest can persist for long periods of time with little or nothing happening. And the parties just disagree on what should be there. A dispute arises when at least one of them makes an explicit change, asks for demand, or demands a change in the status quo on that issue. That is where it stands right now. So here the demand for the change in the status quo is being made by the United States to the Taliban, that they want to change the status quo, which is about, for example, sponsoring camps and the like in Afghanistan. Now, the key is when this arises, this doesn't mean that the other side automatically gives them what they want, but that resolving this dispute requires an outcome that both sides accept. And at some point, that's what's going to end this dispute. Now, these disputes can become more explicit and latent or less so. And they often wax and wane over time. And they can last, these conflicts of interest can last for decades in many cases. So for example, if you think about some of the biggest territorial conflicts in current world politics, like the disagreement between India and Pakistan, and to a lesser extent China, over the possession of Kashmir, that's existed since India and Pakistan became independent countries in the late 1940s. So there you've got a latent conflict of interest that's lasted for over 60 years, almost 70 years now. It has produced several different wars at different times, and it's produced different periods of tension. Okay, resolving that dispute at some point requires India and Pakistan to agree on how to resolve that. And they haven't done that yet, so this conflict of interest persists. Okay, what's key out of this is what we're going to look at are what are the proximate causes of war. Why do particular incidents and demands lead to war at a given point in time? So why is it that the United States went to war with the Taliban in October of 2001? And that's what we're going to try and explain. We're not going to explain what in some sense are the ultimate causes, which are the underlying conflicts of interest. And that's precisely because these underlying conflicts of interest can persist for long periods of time without actually producing fighting. And so what we want to talk about instead is why is it particular events go that way? So for example, you may have heard that last year was the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War in Europe. First World War was an immensely important conflict that had profound effects on the world, particularly profound effects on Europe that persist to today. Now, if you've read something about the origins of World War I, historians will often divide this into two areas. One are these ultimate causes, which are why were there big conflicts of interest among the European powers that drove things like arms races and competition over alliances, that produced a whole string of crises, none of which ended in a large general war that became known as World War I until the July crisis in 1914. The proximate causes are, why is it that the 1908 Bosnian crisis did not end up in a general war, but the 1914 July crisis did? And so what we're going to focus on here is not so much the ultimate causes, but in fact we're just going to sort of in some sense assume them. We're going to focus on the proximate causes. Why do particular events go that way? And here the key thing I want to make is it's something about the price of peace. So that if you want peace, what you have to ask, and there's a demand out there, so you have a dispute going on, is what are you willing to give up so you don't have to fight? And that's a very key thing here, because again, if you want to explain this, you've got to talk about what both parties do. And to do that, I want to go back to a story that takes us again back to World War I, which is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Okay, this is a map of the Eastern Front in 1917, and here's the front line. Here's sort of what Russia was. So Germany and Austria-Hungary occupied Russian Poland and some other areas, like up there is Lithuania and Latvia, and they occupied other areas here. And World War I was not a happy time for Russia. And that although they generated a very, very large army and fought a great deal, their sort of war effort is sort of plagued by two very, very large problems. I'm going to talk about these in reverse order. The first is military incompetence. And that although they had many soldiers who tried to fight very, very hard and very, very bravely, they also had a number of incompetent generals. They had some who were pretty good. And as a result, they lost huge numbers of men, as was true for almost every country in World War I, throughout all this. And this military incompetence meant that they were losing the war, which is why they were fighting predominantly on what was Russian territory. The other thing that was a large problem was that, as was the case when they went to war, all of a sudden they've got to produce a lot of things that they weren't producing normally, like lots and lots of artillery shells and rifles and machine guns and everything else. this triggered a general inflation in Russia, because one of the things is they drew a lot of manpower out of rural areas. A lot of the peasants they enlisted into the military to build up a really big army. Means food production went down. They had a very, very profound problem of inflation. This triggered a series of internal crises that led to two revolutions in Russia. The first that led to the downfall of the Tsar and a short-lived democratic government, which was then overthrown by the Bolsheviks in the fall of 1917. And with the Bolsheviks, part of their platform when they came to power was that they were going to end the war, and they wanted to go to peace. And so what they did was, after they came to power, Lenin, who was the head of the Bolsheviks, sent who was effectively his number two man, Leon Trotsky, to a peace conference at the town behind German lines of Brest-Litovsk, right here. And what they did was the Bolsheviks they knew they had to give the Germans a lot to end the war. And they really wanted to end the war. So they got there, though, and they found out that the Germans demanded a lot more than they were willing to give. And so Trotsky came up with a brilliant solution. He unilaterally declared peace. He stood at the table and said, "We are no longer at war, we're at peace." He got back on a train and he went back to what was then called Petrograd, is now St. Petersburg again, and then during the Soviet Union was referred to as Leningrad, because that's where the Bolshevik government was. And the Germans had a simple response. "We too want peace of Ukraine." And what happened immediately then, after the Soviets unilaterally declared peace, is much of what was left of the Russian army went home. After all, it was peace. And so the Germans then moved eastward. And this second map here shows all the territory they occupied after this first negotiating time in Brest-Litovsk. They moved east. They were very interested in Ukraine because it produces a lot of grain. And at this point in World War I, the British blockade, the British and its allies, was slowly but surely starving Germany out. And that by getting access to Ukraine, they would get more grain so they could feed their people and their army and continue the war. And so the Germans swept east and took everything they wanted. So what happened? The Bolsheviks, knowing they had to end this and stop it, they sent Trotsky back. And Trotsky said, "We accept your first terms." And the Germans go, "No, no, 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 no. We're in a different position now. We want more." And they basically forced them to hand over large amounts of territory and then sign that deal, because at that point they had to do anything to get peace. And as a result, see, what that shows is that whether you have war or peace depends on what both sides do. That you can't unilaterally choose it one or the other. And if we want to explain it, we have to think about what both parties do. And in that, one of the key considerations both sides have is, what is the price of peace? How much do you have to give up if you don't want to fight? And that's a very important consideration, and we want to talk a little bit more carefully about that. Okay, so now what I want to do is I'm going to develop a series of arguments about bargaining from bargaining theory, because that's essentially what the story is underlying this, is that when these disputes arise, somebody wants to change the way things are in world politics. It might be control of territory, it might be the political issues, like in the Afghanistan case, or it might be control of territory like it was in the Brest-Litovsk case. And how we want to think about that is, because it takes the agreement of both to end that dispute and resolve the issue, they're going to bargain over that. And that's going to be a different kind of bargaining we're used to, but I want to think about how can we think about bargaining systematically that'll help us understand what's going on and why it is parties turn to violence sometimes as opposed to others. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I've drawn a line out here, and we can imagine that this is a division of territory between two different countries. And the key thing is, you could draw boundaries in a lot of places. So like, for example, if B was Russia in our Brest-Litovsk example and A was Germany, there's lots of different ways you could draw that border between the two. It might have been what the Germans originally offered was something here, said, okay, we want a lot of territorial gain. But then in the second round, they asked for a lot more because they were in a lot better military position. And that's a way to think about it, is there's many places you could draw that border, and so there's many different settlements that are possible. If you think about that case in Afghanistan, you notice there were like 5 or 6 different separate demands there. Now, you could do lots of partial steps on those. And out of that, you could do lots of things that would present different ways to think about how they could bargain out a resolution to the issue. Now, the key is that the interests of the parties in this dispute are opposed. Because A wants things over here, B wants to put the outcome over here, but we can only put it in one place. So A wants to move it this way, B wants to move it that way. That's the sense of what their imposed interests are. So between the Germans and the Bolsheviks in late World War I, each of them wanted more of the territory. And if one got more, the other lost. That's a sense of opposed interest there. Between the Taliban and the United States in 2001, there's all those demands that President Bush made. Now, the Taliban might have been willing to grant some, but not others. And different ways you could put that, those are opposed interests, because the Taliban didn't want to do those things under that setting. Okay, so what I want to look at here first is I want to think about how valuable is fighting to each party. And to do that, what I'm going to do here first for A is I'm going to find what's called its reservation point. And what the reservation point is it's the peaceful settlement that's equivalent to fighting in the eyes of that party. And it has two parts. One is, well, they presumably have some expectation about what happens if they actually go to war. And then they can say, well, if we fight, we think we have a chance of, at the end of the war, getting an outcome that looks like this. Problem is, if I fight, well, one thing that's true about war is people get killed, property gets destroyed, resources get wasted on the military. All those things are costly. And so the value of a settlement then looks like that expected outcome minus some costs of war, however big those are. And then for A, what we have is this is its reservation point. That is the negotiated settlement that looks as good to it as fighting does. Okay, now out of that, what we can say is that all the settlements that A likes better than fighting are all these over this way. Because remember, A wants outcomes more towards the right side of the board as you see it. B is going to want ones more towards the left. So what A's reservation point tells me are, what are all the things that A sees as equivalent to fighting? So it might be in that case, like in the Brest-Litovsk case, the Bolsheviks didn't think they were in a really good position. They really wanted peace badly. They might have been willing to give up a lot. Okay. And so what are the things that influence these reservation points? So each side's reservation point is a settlement that it views as equal to going to war. And there's three parts that affect that. One is, how well does it expect its military to fight in a war? And in a few classes, I'll talk a little bit more about this, about what factors contribute to winning wars, because that's a measure of military power. And that matters because what you think is going to happen when the shells start flying and people start dying influences what you're willing to give up at the bargaining table. The second thing that matters is, what costs of war is it willing to bear? Is it a situation where it's all in and willing to fight a total war at any level? Or is it one in which the commitment of the country is much less and it's not willing to bear large costs of war? So for example, in the wars that the United States has experienced in your lifetime, those are inherently limited wars for the United States. That we haven't had a regular draft to pull in to build as large an army as the United States could. We haven't engaged in a full economic mobilization to produce as large and powerful a military as we could. And indeed, what that's a reflection of is something about how important those issues are for the United States. And that's a sense of a limited war. That's very different from a total war like World War I and World War II were for the combatants, in which they mobilized everything out of their country that they possibly could, built as large an army, as powerful an army as they could. Part of what affects what cost you're willing to bear is how valuable is the issue to the country. Because in some sense, that's what the cost is telling you about. How important is this? And remember, that's judged by the relevant political classes in a country. So in the Brest-Litovsk case, that's the German military leadership, because at that point, Germany is close to a military dictatorship, even though it still has a Kaiser. And in Russia, it's being driven by the Bolsheviks. Okay. Those things matter. Now, the key thing is these are subjective judgments by national leaders, where they know their own values, but they don't know the values of the other side. So one of the things that's key about these reservation points, and I'm going to put in a fancy term here, they're private information. That is, you may have a very good idea what your reservation point is, but the other side doesn't. And as a result, you have to judge this. This is also important then because what it also means is that parties have a position in negotiations that's different from their reservation point. So when they're bargaining, they may sit there in the back of their head and say, well, I actually, I've demanded 5 or 6 different things. I'd settle for the first 2 or 3 on my list, but obviously I'd like to get more. And so my position is going to be, I want all 6 of those. In the same way that the position of the Germans at Brest-Litovsk was driven by the fact that they thought they were in a really good military position. And they wanted more because they thought they needed more. But they also thought they were in a position to get that. So a big important difference here in bargaining is the difference between the reservation point and the position. Okay, I'll elaborate on that a little bit more because that's going to be very, very key to this story here. All right, so let me take a second here. We're going to do another active learning activity. Okay, and here the question is, why were the demands of the Bush administration so extensive? Mark all of them that apply. And you've got 5 different ones here, from they were confident that military action could win the war, 9/11 attacks called for a strong response, they wanted an excuse for war in the Middle East, they believed they could limit the cost of war with few U.S. personnel killed, and the Taliban needed to be taught a lesson so they could respect human rights. Okay, go ahead and mark the ones that you think are appropriate, and you should be able to mark more than one. Okay. All right, got up to 91 responses. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Okay. One is, okay, and these are just going to match the 3 things I talked about, which is the first is they were confident that military action could actually produce a result they wanted. That was a key part of the story. That was not obvious in the fall of 2001. Because after all, Afghanistan's a long way away. No easy way to get there. It was not clear what kind of military action they could do, but the Bush administration was confident of that. Second, the issue, or this is the number 3 point here, the issue was really important, that they believed that this called for a strong response, and that therefore the issue was important enough that they could justify the cost of war, in which they then also pointed out that they believed they could limit the cost of war with few U.S. personnel killed. And indeed, at the interstate portion of that war, only 1 U.S. personnel, a CIA contractor, was killed, and that was near the end of the process. So they had a strategy by which they could very carefully limit the cost of war in terms of U.S. personnel who were killed. And so those are the 3 parts that affect their reservation level. And that's one reason why the demands or the position was very extensive. They thought they were in a good position where if they didn't get what they wanted to, they could use their military to produce an outcome that they could be happy with. Now, of course, what happened after then, with the evolution of the insurgency in Afghanistan and the long U.S. military commitment there, is a different story. But at this stage, they thought they could do this. Okay, so what about B? So here I have A's reservation point from before. So for B, we have the same thing. We have an expected outcome for the war. We have B's cost of war, which now it makes it over here, and here we have B's reservation point. And it's the same thing. It depends on the same 3 things. What do you think is going to happen when you start fighting? How costly do you think the war is going to be? And how important is the issue for you? Are you willing to pay those costs to get what you want? And all 3 of those matter. So out of that then, now here we have, remember, A prefers things to the right. It'll take any settlement that's better than its reservation point from its point of view. B wants things towards the left side. So again, it will prefer any of the settlements there. And notice that what's true out of this figure is there's an overlap, which is known as the zone of agreement. This is a set of settlements that both would prefer to fighting. And here, the key thing out of it is that because war is costly, there should always be settlements that both sides prefer to fighting. And so the story I'm going to develop, or the way I'm putting this puzzle is, why do countries choose to fight sometimes when there are settlements out there that both of them would prefer to fighting? Why can't they find one of those settlements and agree on it? And I'm going to develop two stories, one today and one a week from today. They're going to talk about why they fail here. And here's and that's sort of one of the key things out of this. And so here the idea is that there's always a zone of agreement. Okay. Now, all right. This is an example of principle one, that they have some interests in common and some in conflict. The conflicting interest is each wants the best deal it can get. It wants to push that outcome closer to its end of the line it likes better. The U.S. wanted to get all 6 of those demands. Germany wanted more of the territory. Russia wanted Germany to have less. The common interest here is they'd like to avoid fighting. Because after all, one of those things that's true about every war is at least one side, the loser, regrets having fought it. You know, Adolf Hitler probably had some second thoughts on April 29th, 1945, that the whole World War II thing didn't quite work out like he planned. That's what the common interest is. Now, it can also be the case, obviously, that after the fact, both sides might regret fighting, as one might think might be the case in the Afghan war, in which certainly many in the United States regret having gone to that war with the lengthy, expensive commitment it's created. And also at the same time, you have to think that perhaps the Taliban leadership wonders if they could have done something differently. And so here the puzzle we get to is, why don't the parties resolve their differences peacefully? That is, why is it they can't find an outcome in the zone of agreement? Okay, and here I'm going to have you go, and this one you can talk to your neighbor about. And so what I want to ask you, this is a question now about the zone of agreement in the Afghan case. Now, this is a speculative question. We don't know the right answer to this. So take a moment and talk to your neighbor about this. And here I've given you a variety of different possible settlements they could have agreed on in that short period before U.S. military action started. And they range from A, which is most favorable to the Taliban, all the way down to, I think, E, which is sort of most favorable to U.S. interests. So go ahead and talk to your neighbor and send in an answer you want. There's not necessarily a right answer here because we don't know, because this wasn't actually explored. But go ahead and talk to your neighbor about it and send in an answer. Okay? All right, I'm going to go ahead and finish this one up. So if you want to send in an answer, go ahead. And remember, there's not a right answer to this one. What it's designed to do is get you to think about what sort of settlements might have made both sides better off than fighting the war. Okay. The most popular answers here are in the neighborhood of like C and D, which have much more limited things about these. So notice that like A is one that's a position that's pretty favorable to Taliban interests. And notice this, in some ways, would have been in the U.S. interests. It would have been bin Laden was out at large for over 10 years after, or close to 10 years after the U.S. military action in Afghanistan and the overthrow of the Taliban. It would have been very advantageous at that time if the United States could have brought him in and tried him, or at least put him away. That ideologically, that would have been very useful. B is a little bit stronger option because what it essentially means is here the Taliban don't turn over bin Laden, they expel him from the country, as he had been expelled from Sudan in 1996. Some of these are more favorable. Had the UN tried bin Laden, if part of the problem is the Taliban don't believe what the US is saying and they don't trust the United States to carry out a fair trial, let somebody else do it. This one obviously is, the D and E are much more extensive ones that favor US interests. And the point here is to understand is if you go back and think about the position in the early fall of 2001, knowing what we know now, some of these settlements would have been better for the US than what happened. And that what US interests probably centered on was closing down al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan to prevent them from continuing to train large numbers of people, to shut down their operation. Now that's one of the things the invasion produced. But also notice from the Taliban point of view that many of these might have been better too. Now, no one exactly knows where Mullah Omar is. He had been the head of the Taliban. He's a blind Muslim cleric. In the United States, it's widely believed he's hiding in the tribal areas of Pakistan, but his presence isn't known. And indeed, one of the questions they're asking now is, should they actually open up negotiations with the sort of what the Taliban has turned into over time? And would he be a useful person at that? So all I want to try to do is just sort of reflect, looking back now, 13 plus years to the start of the war, that there probably were settlements out there that would have been better than what happened. And even though that's a case where many of you might have said at the first, well, the United States had to do something strong. But then again, something strong means going to war, and war often doesn't turn out exactly like you think it's going to. Okay, so here's the key out of it, which is that there's a difference between reservation point and position. And that's because there may be deals that both sides prefer to war. Each of them wants the best deal it can get. And so it might advance a position that's much stronger than what it's willing to settle for. So for example, if I think about the Bush administration in 2001, we have those 6 demands. We know what their position is. What we don't know is what their reservation point was behind that. Now we think we know that they were pretty confident about it, and therefore probably had a pretty, probably really needed a lot, but exactly what, if anything, they'd be willing to give up, we don't know. And so here, one of the stories about why they end up fighting is that there's a conflict over which settlement is out there. It's like the Germans and the Bolsheviks again, which is how much of the territory are the Germans going to get. They disagree over that. So it's not just enough to say, let's just choose any old settlement that's better than fighting, because you have to say which one. And each of them wants the best one it can get. Now, in those negotiations, after they've made demands, threats of war are one way to try and coerce the other side into doing what you want. This is our logic of threats and promises. So that I want you to give me more and do what I want. I threaten you with war because it's a way to try and leverage something out of you. And out of this, there are a variety of different coercive bargaining tactics out there. One of those we've already seen, which is ultimatum. That's what the Bush administration said. It's the strongest threat in world politics. Do as I say or I will go to war. It's very strong. Now, in most international crises, you don't see that. What you see are more veiled threats of war. Now, the Afghanistan case is nice. It's a really clear, explicit ultimatum. Another very coercive bargaining tactic is fait accompli. So if two parties have a disagreement over where their boundary is, and they each think it should be in a different place, what a fait accompli is, it's French for accomplished fact, is one side moves its military into where it thinks the border is and challenges the other to start a war and attack it if it doesn't accept that. So if I go back, again, a little bit over 50 years to 1962, India and China fought a brief border war over the exact location of their common border in the Himalayas. That war was triggered in part by an Indian fait accompli, which is that the Indians moved their troops into where they thought the border was and challenged the Chinese to do something about it. The Chinese remained very, very quietly. They built up their forces and they clobbered the Indians in about a 2 or 3 week war. And then they moved their troops up to where they thought the border would be and said, this is where it's effectively going to be. But see, that led to war because fait accompli, the Indians imposing on the ground where they wanted the border to be, is extremely provocative, almost as provocative as ultimatum. Well, here the key thing, though, is if you make threats of war, how do you make these credible? Because remember, effective threats, which is what you want to do, you want to get the other side to give you what you want, depend on credibility and consequences. And the problem with the credibility here is because war is costly and risky, the targets may tend to discount those threats. So for example, we don't exactly know all of what the Taliban talked about. They both had consultations inside their government. They also brought a large number of elders and leaders from all around Afghanistan to consult. But presumably part of what their discussion must have been about is, what are these Americans going to do to us? They're on the other side of the world. You know, we run this area. We've lived here. We know it. We've taken control of this country. Or most of this country, we know how to do this. What can they do to us? And so that although President Bush may have been completely honest that he would go to war if he didn't get everything, and in fact, he did go to war, the Taliban, when they look at this, they say, what can these guys do to us? We don't think they can do it. We think that they're just talking big, and we have to see whether or not they'll actually back it up. And so that one of the things that's always hard about threats to use force is they're difficult to make those credible. And that matters because the more credible they are, the more likely they are to be effective. That is, to get the other side to give you the concessions you want. Okay, out of that, what makes this harder is, again, this difference between reservation point and position. The position is the demands they state publicly. Their reservation point is what they would actually settle for at the end, or settle for if it was actually on the table. And the trick is, parties have a big incentive to make their position much stronger than their reservation point. And that's because if it works and gets the other side to give you what you want, you don't have to go to war. You get a really good settlement that advances the interests you want, and you don't have to fight. This is, in some sense, what we can think of as the problem of sheep in wolves' clothing. That is the idea that types, or those that really don't want to fight, the sheep, want to pretend like they're wolves and that they are willing to fight. Because if they convince the other side that they really are wolves, they'll get what they want. But the problem is the other side understands this. And as a result, they tend to discount those threats. That's one reason why crises are very, very difficult, because each side believes that the other will actually not follow through on this. Okay, now what that means then is to make those threats credible, you have to change the other side's perception that you will not carry out your threat. And because they believe that your threat is not credible, that you're not willing to do this, and you have two tools to increase that credibility. Change their perception through persuasion, which is on Wednesday, we'll talk about perceptions, what they are, and how you can persuade other people. And then also commitment devices, things that change your own willingness to fight and thereby make your threat more credible because the other side understands that you're willing to carry through it because of your own judgments. Oh, okay. I actually want to take a second because I think this is the key points one. This is going to sort of be the ending point here, but I want to actually talk a little bit about practical bargaining for a second, because this is actually one of the points in this class where you can learn a life skill that will be helpful for you throughout your life, which is as you get older, you will find yourself in positions where you can bargain over things. And when you bargain, having some understanding of the logic of bargaining can help you get better settlements. So for example, when you get later on in life and you start buying and selling property, that's one of the few times in your life when you can make thousands, or in some cases tens of thousands of dollars with a few hours of well-conducted bargaining. So it can make a huge difference in your income. And so the bargaining is very, very central. But what's key out of this is exactly these sorts of problems, which is that in bargaining, parties often ask for more than they're willing to do. And then what you have to judge is how far can I push them to get what I want. So one of the examples I like to think about this, because I think many students can relate to this, think about buying a used car. So you want to buy a used car from me, and I put it out there and I said, used car for sale, $2,000, that's what I want for it. And you look at the car and you go, that's not a bad car. I'd pay $1,500 for it. But all you know right now is I said I would take $2,000 for it. What you don't know is where's my reservation point, which is how much I would actually sell the car for. Now you might look at it and say, well, this car isn't worth more than $1,500, but I actually don't want to pay $1,500. Maybe I could offer him $1,200 and see if he takes that. Because, it's not that nice a car. You might want to get rid of it, and as a result. And so now what you have to judge out of this is if I said, look, I'll take 2,000, how low can you go and still get the car? Now, whether or not there's a zone of agreement here matters on whether or not our values of the cars match. So it might be my reservation point is $1,400. I'll accept $1,400 or more to sell the car, and you're willing to spend up to $1,500. We have a zone of agreement. But the problem is we don't know that because each of us acts more aggressively than we would otherwise. Okay, that's one of the things where bargaining can actually matter practically. Because what you'll find as you go forward in life, you will have some opportunities where you can bargain, and it's a place where you can make money. And so thinking about that's very important in this. And now what's different about this is please don't threaten to use force against people you're bargaining with. It gets you in trouble because you're sent off to jail and the like. But in a lot of settings, the same sort of logic of bargaining and how you bargain exists in these settings as in everyday settings in a similar way as they happen in world politics. Okay, let me give you a little idea where we go before we go and talk about key points. So on Wednesday, I'm going to talk about perceptions. What are perceptions and how can you change the perceptions of others, why that's a really hard thing to do, and how it can be done under the right circumstances in a way that talks about when you can actually persuade within the context of crisis bargaining. And there the primary example is going to be the origins of World War II in Europe. A week from today, so the story I've developed so far today is that the problem you have is a bargaining problem that it's not enough to say we want to have a peaceful settlement. We have to choose a particular peaceful settlement, and we disagree about which one it is, and because we each want to act tougher than we actually are, we somehow can't identify a particular settlement that both of us would accept. Next Monday, I'm going to develop another story which has to do with the ability of these settlements to persist over time. Okay, the last one I want to do here is identify the key points from today's lecture. And I've got 6 different ones there for you to talk about, from the price of peace, what the definition of reservation point, the fact that reservation points are private information. Although there are settlements both for the war, they may not agree on which. The credibility of threats to use force in a crisis, often in doubt, and incentives to misrepresent. That is the idea that you may talk tougher than you actually are. Now, all these are important points. Which ones do you think are the most important? Go ahead and mark those, and we'll see. And then I'll show you what I think out of this 6 are the most important. Okay, we got 55 replies. Oh, come on, just a few more. Okay. Okay. Now, I think all 6 of these are important. The ones I think are most important are the definition of the reservation point, and it looks like close to 80% of you picked that. More than that, like 85 to 90% of you chose that although there are settlements both for the war, they may not agree on which. That's very, very key. Oops. And the last one's important are the incentives to misrepresent, which few of you picked, but I just want to come that up to catch. Now, I think all 6 of those points are important, but if you ask me which ones are the most important, I choose those 3. Okay, and on Wednesday, we will talk about perceptions.